Hey all, I wrote another essay type thing that I'm going to read to you. This one is on the whole Mass Effect Andromeda, bad animations, ugly Sarah Ryder controversy. The reviews are in for Mass Effect Andromeda now, and they're mixed. Meanwhile, a lot of gamers are furious, and I think even if the reviews had been amazing, many gamers wouldn't have trusted them because what they've seen with their own eyes isn't very good, and this is a failure of marketing. So I wanted to examine that phenomenon as opposed to the game itself, because I haven't played the game, because EA treats me like I stink. Now, obviously there are going to be some spoilers in this, not for Mass Effect Andromeda because I haven't played it, but for past BioWare games. So if for whatever reason you haven't played Dragon Age Inquisition, there might be some minor spoilers here. Just being careful. Okay, here we go. Excuse my eyeline, but I am going to be reading the screen. Okay, here goes. The issue of graphics in Mass Effect Andromeda seems to be getting bigger instead of going away. I maintain that's due to bad marketing as opposed to a game that is necessarily overall bad. Based on the reviews, it's just okay. Bad facial animations haven't gotten in the way of us enjoying past BioWare games. Dragon Age Origins, anyone? Those animations were awful. There's more going on this time, though. The combination of secrecy and a drip, drip, drip of bad news is a toxic combination that lost Hillary Clinton the presidency and will lose BioWare some sales on Andromeda. When The Witcher 3 launched, there were issues with it. I got hit by a bug that meant Geralt couldn't run. There were frame rate issues late game, and we all had a good laugh about Roach the Horse's magical ability to walk on roofs and tents. But we forgave all that. The Witcher 3 ended up on numerous Game of the Year lists, including my own. What's the difference here? Marketing. Gamers don't feel like CD Projekt Red is looking down on them from a moral perspective. CDPR has its own moral crusades against things like DRM, but there's a big difference in condemning a practice and condemning people, and BioWare crossed that social justice line a few years back. Through public statements, GDC talks, and hires of people who have made controversial statements on the subjects of sex, gender, race, and other stuff, BioWare started a culture war with their own fans. It started innocently enough. EA defended the inclusion of gay men who actually acted like gay men instead of just announcing that they're gay and doing absolutely nothing about it. Gamers could understand that defense because that was EA defending BioWare's right to make any freaking game it wants to make. As long as the game was overall a satisfying experience, most gamers really don't care if characters are gay, straight, or any orientation in between. We have to stop talking like the default gamer is a white, straight, cisgendered man, because a gamer is anyone who enjoys games. But since then, BioWare products under EA's management have suffered a notable increase in lecturing and a notable reduction in quality on multiple counts. The ending of Mass Effect 3, BioWare's first major narrative stumble, and it broke the trust that fans had in the ongoing quality of the games in that series. The rush job that was Dragon Age 2 was also cause for concern, but that wasn't the fault of the developers. They made the best game they could in the time they had. But while Dragon Age Inquisition sold well, narratively, it was a mess. It was obvious that Hawke's story was not finished in Dragon Age 2, and so they finished it as a subplot that kind of tied into the main plot in Inquisition. But Inquisition's characters, to borrow a concept from comic book writer Alan Moore, started killing off romance in pursuit of raw, cynical sex. Romance options in BioWare games are increasingly more like lead-up to sex options, and since you can't actually have sex with a video game, that makes little sense. Gamers noticed other changes. Cassandra's appearance was notably different between Dragon Age 2 and Inquisition, but Varric didn't even really change his clothes. Meanwhile, Morrigan, a character who had a baby as a plot point, still fits into her pre-baby clothes and apparently hasn't aged a day. For the record, I still think Cassandra is awesome, and it would have been great to see Morrigan evolve some. In their apparent attempts to reduce the so-called male gaze in their games, BioWare did the opposite. They enforced the male gaze by creating a stronger dichotomy between women who primarily exist to be pleasing to men and all other kinds of women. Beautiful or useful, ladies? Pick one. This is what happens when people practice feminism by feels. You end up getting the theory wrong and satisfying no one. Granted, the Dragon Age team isn't the same team as the people who work on Mass Effect, so let's jump over to the Mass Effect franchise. In the original Mass Effect trilogy, the woman ran the gamut from Miranda, a self-proclaimed perfect woman, to Tali, who had bird legs and less exposed skin than a woman in a burqa. As many fans found Tali attractive as Miranda, and then Liara had her devoted fans, as did Ashley. Since the original game, however, BioWare hasn't done much to deviate from this limited selection of female romance options, and Tali wasn't even a romance option in the first game. With the exception of comm specialist Samantha Trainer, all the female romance options are either white or blue and model slim. BioWare has been pretty invested in the traditional Hollywood beauty myth, and they've been so fixated on sexual orientation, they seem to have forgotten that there are other elements to diversity and choice. Now, let's be clear. I'm not advocating that developers have to come at their games from a social justice perspective. There's a big difference between using an issue to inform a game and a circumstance where propaganda overwhelms fun. So let me put this as simply as I can. It's just that people don't want to play games made by people who seem to hate them or who are just exploiting them for money. And BioWare hasn't done enough to celebrate its fan base to take away the sting of all that scolding. This brings us to the Ugly Rider scandal, the sometimes angry, sometimes humorous backlash to the technical inadequacies in the designs and animations of prominent Mass Effect Andromeda characters, notably the default female playable option, Sarah Ryder. At its best, this backlash has created some pretty hilarious memes. At its darkest, a developer got harassed based on an accusation by a citizen journalist that BioWare claims is false. I'm not going to repeat that accusation or name the developer because I don't want to add to that mess. Seriously, people, if you don't like a game, just don't buy it. Complain to your heart's content, but don't tell anyone that they deserve to die over a video game. These admittedly bad moments are treated as normal behavior by the mainstream press, and the people who make these references to death don't even really mean it, so cut it out. It's just making the rest of us look bad. I can understand why non-gamers have a bad impression of us when it seems game developers are terrified of their own fans. There's an artificial wall created by the press between developers and gamers, and my analysis here is intended to help break that down a little. So here's where I think this whole rollout to Mass Effect Andromeda went horribly wrong. For 2 years, we got really uninformative coming soon videos from BioWare showing developers working on the game, like this, but very little of Andromeda itself. That was followed by an extremely brief teaser trailer that many found promising. Actress and model Jade Rossi announced that she was providing the motion capture acting for the female lead, and that set expectations in fans' minds about who and what Sarah Ryder was going to be. Based on previous depictions of geek-bait actresses like Claudia Black, who played Morrigan, and Yvonne Strahovski, who played Miranda, it was fair for would-be gamers to assume that their next playable female hero was going to be glamorous and traditionally beautiful. Instead, they got a librarian with 2 black eyes. And the online war began. The knee-jerk response from gamers who felt deceived again was that BioWare was deliberately making Rossi look ugly to make a political point. The counterattack was that gamers were perverts invested in the male gaze. Some outlets even blamed the outcry on Gamergate, which got the whole thing backwards. Many of the more moderate and sane Gamergaters were those who also participated in the retake Mass Effect consumer revolt. And these gamers were still stinging from being dismissed as entitled by the game's press. Those wounds haven't healed yet. Rossi herself said on Facebook that the demo had her a bit edged up. I'm not sure exactly what that means, but I've heard the term used to refer to a photographer getting the camera too close to a model's face, resulting in a distorted image You know, kind of like the one your dog creates by thinking that sniffing the camera will make for a totally better picture. Either way, BioWare hired a very beautiful woman, then made her look like she went jogging in the same makeup she'd worn out clubbing the night before. Ugh. BioWare's solution, or band-aid, or whatever you want to call it for this, was to hide Sarah Ryder from promos while they tried to fix the admitted mess that was her face. It seems that BioWare tried to minimize the train wreck by taking away the heavy eye makeup, but there's still a strange raccoon eyes phenomenon that makes it look like she just finished her shift as a mechanic. Meanwhile, her brother Scott looks like a model in an ad for a gay dating site. And of course he does. It's a BioWare game. Of course, it wouldn't be a video game debate without some contingent whining about how hard it is to create good-looking female characters in video games. It's harder to mocap women. It's so expensive to create new animation frames. Okay, say that's true. Mass Effect already did it in the 3 previous games. And since then, Far Cry Primal, Horizon Zero Dawn, and The Witcher 3 all managed to do it, as has, every fighting game ever made. You gotta ask yourself, why is it that game franchises accused of sexism are going about their business including women in their games, while the studio that likes to lecture us about social justice hired a familiar model for their female lead, then artificially gave her the skin of a chain smoker? It isn't even that Ryder isn't wearing makeup at all. She's got eyeshadow, lipstick, and eyeliner on the inner rims of her eyes. So is a little concealer too much to ask? The women prominently featured in the Mass Effect Andromeda marketing aren't diverse, and they're not pro-women. They're, to borrow a term from Howard Stern, the beauty myth with butterface. Everything is model perfect but her face. These women are white when they're not blue, slim, small-busted. Basically, we have women with bodies straight off a fashion catwalk. But soldiers, athletes, and first responders, the sort of women who more accurately reflect the role of a pathfinder, don't look like that. Yeah, the body of a model is beautiful, but it's only beautiful. It isn't designed to communicate strength, leadership, or individuality. Models are commodities when they're at work. Heroines are something very different. And gamers are too smart to fall for the idea that diversity consists of an Asari that lost a staring contest with a permanent marker and a blonde woman who looks way too old for that I hate my parents haircut. Worse, the official stats for the women on MassEffect.com don't match how they actually look. Cora is officially 172 centimeters tall and around 61 kilograms. That's just between 5'6" and 5'7" tall and about 134 pounds. Here's what women who are about those proportions really look like, thanks to the photographic height and weight chart website. Now here's Cora. I call bullshit, BioWare. Cora's proportions more accurately reflect a woman who is 5'9" at that weight. So BioWare is actively distorting what a 5'6"-ish, 134-pound woman looks like. That contributes to negative body image in real-world women. That creates real harm. And I have a very high bar for making that claim. This is the horseshoe effect hooked up to an FTL drive, a form of social justice that looks a lot like sexism. When your gay characters look like this, and your lesbian characters look like this, that sends a message. The gay men are ideally masculine, even though many real-life gay men aren't. The lesbian character draws on stereotypes of sexual orientation instead of gendered ideals. These characters aren't drawing from the same paradigm and therefore aren't equal. Similarly, when your twins don't look like twins, it's understandable why some fans think that something's up. Fans aren't asking that Sarah Ryder conform to the male gaze. They just want a heroine in heroic tradition. Pardon the pun, paragon instead of a plain Jane. You have to admit that Sarah doesn't really look very heroic. I mean, okay, Scott looks a bit like a hobbit, but there's still a sort of heroic tradition for that. Since this is a character you can customize anyway, it's a really strange marketing decision to make a box art image straight from the uncanny valley. Game character designs are shorthands that tell the player what they're supposed to do with these characters in game. Sarah Ryder is a character that looks like she's supposed to go to a space library, not into combat. Now, okay, perhaps you could say that Scott is too pretty for that role too. Granted, he's also too pretty to bottom for our Krogan, so overall I have no idea what they were thinking with these designs. Okay, I'll give you a moment to walk that Krogan joke off. Possibly over the line, right? Good. Okay, once more into the breach. Not Scott's breach, the proverbial breach. Ah, hell. This is where I think that Mass Andromeda's marketing team made a fatal error. We don't know what's going on, meaning the marketing didn't provide enough information on Scott and Sarah Ryder, so we're forced to judge them primarily on their disparate looks. Unless they knew the game sucked, the marketing team blew it. And I don't have any faith in a marketing department's ability to tell a good game from a bad game. I've met too many of them. Besides, a good marketing department can even make things look amazing that are doing little more than slowly killing you. I mean, look at all those historical cigarette ads. Mass Effect Andromeda isn't a direct sequel, and so a marketing department can't assume the fans assume anything. Andromeda differs from the original Mass Effect series in that FemShep and BroShep were essentially the same character, whereas Scott and Sarah Ryder are different people, and in terms of playable character function, it's difficult to know what that means. In Fallout 4, for instance, you chose between a husband and wife, and whoever you didn't pick got literally and figuratively iced. In the original Resident Evil, however, Jill and Chris had different skills and inventory items as well as different genders. What the defined and separate characters of Scott and Sarah means for the gameplay experience of Mass Effect is important, and something we should have known more about to shape our expectations of the play experience. It could be a potentially interesting experiment if Scott and Sarah were deliberately different character class pre-builds. For instance, she's more of an engineer infiltrator type of character, while he's more soldier adept type character. That would kind of explain why he's flashier looking than her. It would, like the original Resident Evil, take character selection out of the realm of being a totally aesthetic preference when it comes to gender. This connects to the philosophical question with role-playing game design that every game answers differently. Is the RPG experience designed to get the player to play the role of a pre-built character, or is the goal to allow the player to be themselves or anyone they want in a fantasy sci-fi simulator? The Bethesda, Fallout, and Elder Scrolls games definitely fall in the latter category, while games with fixed protagonists like Horizon Zero Dawn and the Witcher games more clearly define the main character for the player, who then has to play along. A player can't make Geralt earnest and Aloy an idiot. They have some hardwired character points, and this is why these games are classified as action RPGs. Traditionally, BioWare games like Baldur's Gate, Neverwinter Nights, and even Dragon Age have been much more traditional RPGs, sacrificing real-time combat elements in an attempt to maximize a player's control over the narrative and the relationships with in-game companions. Accordingly, they're a profoundly difficult type of video game to design and develop, and BioWare's diehard fans keep coming back for the immersive stories, great characters, and inspired world building, even if the combat and facial expressions at times have been pretty clunky. Despite what the press will tell you, BioWare fans recognize that some technical sacrifices must be made to jam that much story, dialogue, and narrative choice into a game. They just don't want graphics that look inferior to those the company produced 10 years ago. Mass Effect, traditionally, has tried to thread the needle between traditional RPG and action shooter, inhabiting a unique niche that results in somewhat less complex storytelling than Dragon Age, but more dynamic gameplay. Mass Effect's first 3 games took place in an amazing world that combined the best elements of Babylon 5, Star Trek, Dune, Farscape, and of course, Star Wars. This familiar territory allowed Mass Effect's original creators to get into Shepard's story relatively quickly. Since then, BioWare has become victims of their own success. Numerous TV, film, and video game properties are borrowing from Mass Effect, meaning Mass Effect now has to be an innovator instead of an imitator. Instead, they decided to rip off the one remaining sci-fi trope they hadn't totally directly poached before: the Star Trek Voyager Battlestar Galactica formula they touched on with the Quarians, but never used with an Alliance team. And so we have Andromeda, which could be nicknamed, and here we go again. Many players didn't notice the rough edges of the original Mass Effect game because there was just so much to discover. But now that the formula is basically unchanged, every mistake is going to show like a pimple on a prom queen's nose. Mass Effect's marketing could have gotten around this by blinding gamers with a few new cool alien races to get excited about. But instead, they gave us the exact same formula. Only the Normandy's now named the Tempest, the Mako is now the Nomad, and your dad looks a bit like the Elusive Man, no matter how much you customize your character. The new enemy was seen only in glimpses. The new planets looked as empty and lifeless as something out of No Man's Sky. And so gamers did the most human thing you could expect them to do. They focused on the thing that was new. Unfortunately for Mass Effect, that new thing was the female lead's facial resemblance to Mr. Ed. If Mass Effect's marketing had allowed us to learn about Scott and Sarah as whole people, maybe we'd care less about what they look like. Maybe Scott was molested by his space priest. Maybe Sarah doesn't want to be judged by her looks. We don't know. Unlike the Witcher games, which picked up where the books left off and treated those stories as canon, we know absolutely nothing about these force-fed avatars who may or may not be at all important. Personally, I think this level of complexity in design was completely unnecessary. The Wii U didn't catch because Nintendo's marketing couldn't convey what it did. Mass Effect marketing, similarly, can't seem to explain its own product. Why are we seeing marketing that focuses so much on faces that players can customize? And why was it announced that Sarah has a model's body? Shouldn't we as players decide what her proportions are? The character creation philosophy is already a mess and the game hasn't even shipped. If Mass Effect games were properly treated as games instead of as movies, there would be no default appearance for Shepard or the Ryder twins. Any rider you create should be just as valid as any other rider. You shouldn't, for instance, be able to look at a rider who's a black guy and immediately recognize that as a deviation from a norm the game set. It's the same mistake Mass Effect made the first time around by only putting Bro Shep on the box art. It others the female avatar. If I'd been marketing the Mass Effect game, much more focus would have been on showing off what your companions can do, both in combat and dialogue. Vetra, the female Turian squad mate, Drac, the Krogan veteran, and Jal, one of those new alien species I mentioned. These characters should have gotten way more play in the trailers. You have to wonder why a studio known for its strong narratives and characters seem to be hiding away the game's narrative and characters. This is what's led to the suspicion among trepidatious fans that the characters and narratives aren't very good. So this, not the isolated default physical appearance of the female playable character, is what's got gamers spooked. Keep in mind, the people I've talked to who are upset, myself included, are fans of the franchise. If marketing had given players more to like, they wouldn't be fixated on one thing they don't like. Players are actually responding to a lack of information. After the ending of Mass Effect 3, players are understandably guarded. But at the end of the day, does it really matter whether the default Sarah Ryder is less than conventionally attractive, considering the character is customizable? Well, yeah, it does, for multiple reasons. First of all, we want our heroines to seem every bit as heroic as their male counterparts because, of that pesky desire for equality. We don't want to see the heroine portrayed as less than the hero in any way, including appearance, because it hints at the attitudes of the game's developers regarding the proper place for women in gaming. We don't want to be seen as mousy affirmative action figures that should feel grateful to be involved at all. That BioWare thought that depiction was good enough to show in marketing does say something about what they think about the women who are passionate about their products. But we also want to see the definition of beauty itself expanded. Beauty isn't expanded by hiring a model to masquerade as a regular woman. That completely misses the point that models are glorious freaks of nature with turbocharged metabolisms and improbable body proportions. We should celebrate women who fit that description, but also celebrate women who don't. We can't do that in the way BioWare went about it because essentially, They didn't proceed on merit-based hiring. If they wanted a more common-looking woman, they should have hired one to play that part. BioWare isn't practicing what it preaches when it comes to inclusion, and this deepens the suspicions in gamers that social justice movements are exploiting insecurities to seize power, not actually making things any more equitable.